So the Centre for Anti-Racist Research, which was set up by Ibram X Kendi, one of the greatest luminaries from the Black Lives Matter moment, you might say, is starting to fall apart, despite the fact that they've had tens of millions of dollars in donations. They're going to have to lay off around 20 staff, and it seems like they haven't really produced very much work in the past couple of years. And I mean, is this a sign that the sort of, the afterglow of Black Lives Matter is going away? I mean, are people starting to wake up and see what the hell they were spending their money on?
Well, it's interesting that they actually still have quite a lot of money. And it's not necessary. I read this fascinating report on it in the New York Times, which basically put down the failures of this centre at Boston University to the fact that people had kind of gone off the boil in relation to Black Lives Matter. And that actually the problem was there isn't as much interest as there was in 2020. And that's why he's having to sack quite a significant number of people from an educational institution, which is like, what I kind of get out. But also it went into detail about how Kendi, had gone to the university and said, what I want to do is I want this to last basically forever. So I'm going to trim it right down. And I know we've only put out a number of op-eds, maybe sort of 2 research papers, despite the fact that we have tens of millions of pounds that have come in from, the ex-head of Twitter, the sort of, all these huge celebrities and institutions who've poured money into this. It's not really my fault. And, the problem with trying to intellectualize a fundamentally intellectual stance, which is that basically his position is that segregation is the answer to anti-racism. He says, anti-discrimination, discrimination on the basis of anti-racism is the solution to discrimination on the basis of racism. If you can get your head around that, he's basically saying, we've got to be mean to each other forever. I mean, I can really boil it down to that. That isn't an intellectual position, and I don't think serious academics would or should engage with that. There's a wealth of extremely useful and important, genuinely anti-racist literatures, going back many, many years, which you could do interesting research projects on. And, they did have this sort of this funding earmarked for a serious thing around COVID and trying to, ascertain data around how, COVID and Black people's interaction with it in response to it and all the rest of it failed to do that. So, on the one level, it's just a kind of basic story of person gets loads of money, isn't very good at managing. But I think it should ask bigger questions about whether or not this is just sort of a plaything for rich people. Anti-racism, and some of the women who have been sacked, and one academic in particular is quoted in the New York Times as saying, anti-racism is a serious issue, and it's become this guy's vanity project, basically, and screw that. And, it's hard to see it as anything other than that.
And Tom, I mean, the thing is, when it comes to Black Lives Matter or that movement, this is not exactly a one-off. I mean, people will think of Patrisse Cullors and her giant mansion that she seems to have managed to wing out of the Black Lives Matter moment.
Yeah, well, technically owned by the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation or whatever.
Yeah.
But yes, no, that was a big moment for a lot of people. What was that, a year or so ago, where essentially in 2020 all this money came flowing in. There was one, obviously Ibram X Kendi is a kind of someone who rose to prominence in that moment. He's got the position of Black Lives Matter, but then Black Lives Matter isn't even one organisation. It's all kinds of different causes, different groups, some of which bear the name, some of which don't. There was one Economist piece at the end of 2020, I think, which estimated that it was something like $10 billion flooded in basically to either the big Black Lives Matter organisations or ones that were affiliated to it or connected to it in some sort of way. It's a huge amount of money sloshing around. And yet time and time again there's been questions about where that money is going. So we're seeing that with Kendi now, as we've been talking about. But again, Black Lives Matter, it's kind of key organisation, this BLM GNF, which was run by Patrisse Cullors until relatively recently, where again they found out, New York Magazine did an investigation, they found that this $6 million mansion had been purchased. It wasn't entirely clear where the money was going in other respects. There were all these kind of local chapters of BLM who were signing open letters being like, what the hell's going on?
Why aren't we seeing any of this money?
No, exactly.
To fund our activities.
And it's tempting to just sort of dismiss it all as a grift and whatever, and there's a large part of that that's quite true. But then there's another element to it, which is the fact that BLM is was a very strange movement insofar as it wasn't really a movement. It was very distributed. It was very kind of leaderless. It was something which didn't have a clear set of articulated demands, to the extent that it did. A lot of people who might have been on the streets campaigning or protesting weren't aware that they also wanted to abolish the nuclear family and all these kinds of things. There was this big gap between what the kind of professors and sort of PMC type people who were running the organizations and the people on the ground who were concerned about the issue. And there was also this confusion as to what organization is doing what. And there was also this fundamental problem that exists with a lot of this anti-racism, full stop, is that as many other criticisms as you could have of it, its tendency towards Kendi-style reverse discrimination, the essentialism of this movement and whatever, is that it's also really obsessed with like the symbolic. It's really obsessed with these hashtags and these statements and whatever. So when it comes down to the hard yards of, okay, what do you want to do? What do you want to investigate? What policy do you want to formulate? They haven't really got anything.
Yeah.
What they've got is a mansion where they can film YouTube videos in, which is essentially what it came down to with BLM. So I think there's in this kind of issue of what happened to all that money, what happened to all that goodwill, there's so many reasons for it. But one I definitely underlined is the fact that so much of this is almost like quasi-spiritual. It's not really properly political in that same sense, which is why when all this money comes in, they don't really know what to do with it.
One of the things I was fascinated by is a lot of the money sloshing around these Black Lives Matter organizations, so much of it went to trans rights stuff, which is, I suppose there's a sort of connection. They're both sort of woke, but I imagine that's not what people imagined they were giving money for.
Yeah, well, obviously there's nothing wrong with funding and creating a sort of intellectual vanguard for a political movement, or putting money into research and things like that. Obviously I'm all for that, but there is this disconnect between the fact that a lot of the particularly in relation to the reaction to George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, a lot of the sort of Black Lives Matter genuine activism, grassroots, whatever you want to call it, on the street by ordinary Black people was about, very localized issues, relationships with the police, and things like, almost mundane demands, like I can't get a house, I can't get a job, I'm treated differently, things that weren't going to be solved by a new research center in Boston University, or, as Tom says, a kind of hub for creatives in some mansion somewhere. And, you have to kind of remember that obviously class politics gets forgotten in relation to this. I know it's difficult to talk about that in relation to America, but there is this sort of, tension, which is that a movement happens around Black people in America and racism, which is, got a lot of normal people involved in it who are making very credible and sort of normal demands about their quality of life, which I think almost then gets hijacked by a kind of Black elite or Black middle class who use it to write books, set up centers, and make a pretty penny and thank you very much. And that's happened with, feminism, here in the UK and in America. It's happened with gay rights. It's happened with all these kind of movements. And so just a level of skepticism here, I think, is necessary among all of us. I don't think we need to go down the sort of who funds you, obsessed with money kind of route, but just a level of kind of critical assessment about who decides that they're speaking for these people, where does this money go, what does this end up in, is necessary.
I think it was funny, looking back on sort of 2020, how quickly you went from the sort of shocking murder of George Floyd and the question of police brutality, how quickly that went from actually, well, the solution is more Black people on television or more diversity on the BBC or whatever it might be.
People were using and abusing George Floyd to like talk about literary awards.
Yeah, getting rid of Uncle Ben. From rice packets and things like this.
It would never have happened.
I'm reading Freddie DeBoer's book at the moment, which is sort of touching on a lot of this stuff. And the examples, you've kind of forgotten about them. But, like there was that flurry of cartoon shows in which previously the voice actor had been white and the character was Black. In one case, the character was half Jewish and half Black. She was Jewish, she wasn't half Black. Therefore, she felt the need to step down. And there's this good line in the book was like, George Floyd died so that this... this character could be recast. That is essentially what it did come down to. But I think it's just a reminder that Black Lives Matter is a kind of identitarian response to a horrendous crime. Was always going to be so lacking because at the same time, the primary people who would be interested in it, the primary people who would benefit from it, were always going to be the diversity workshop facilitators, not the people on the ground. The people who are interested in chastising CEOs for using the wrong words rather than actually doing anything meaningful. The people whose whole lives are about sloganeering and again, language policing and about intangible issues rather than the more material things that confront people. And I think given the fact that this movement was so identitarian, was so symbolic, as I say, was so almost detached from people's everyday lives, it was always going to make it even more likely that it could be dominated to such a degree by people who are basically either useless, on the take, or somewhere in between. So I think maybe that's why we've ended up, really.